In the final weeks of World War II, as the German Reich collapsed under the combined pressure of Allied armies, Munich became a city suspended between resistance and ruin. Few people today realize just how chaotic those last days were. Streets choked with fleeing civilians, abandoned Wehrmacht vehicles stacked against sidewalks, and the occasional desperate pocket of SS forces firing blindly into the night. It was into this fractured landscape that elements of the British 30th Corps, specifically a small reconnaissance detachment attached to the 53rd Welsh Division, entered on April 29, 1945. Their mission was straightforward on paper: secure key administrative residences before they could be destroyed or looted. But what they found inside one of those villas would raise questions that have lingered for decades. The struggle facing these soldiers was not only the threat of isolated German resistance but the uncertainty hidden within every structure they occupied. Urban warfare bred suspicion. A silent hallway could conceal a sniper. A cellar could hide explosives rigged to detonate the moment a door opened. The reconnaissance teams moved with methodical precision, clearing each room, stepping over shattered glass and ornate furnishings that testified to the former luxury of the Nazi elite. One such residence, located near the Bogenhausen district, had been hastily abandoned. Personal belongings lay scattered across the floor, suggesting a rapid escape as Allied armor pushed toward the city center. During the search, Corporal Thomas Harland, a former schoolteacher from Sussex, sifted through a pile of documents that had spilled from a broken cabinet. Amid propaganda pamphlets, requisition forms, and household inventories, he noticed a small bundle of folded papers tied with a thin piece of fabric. The handwriting was delicate, almost hesitant. On the top page was a date: December 20th, 1944. And beneath it, a name, though partially smudged, indicating the letters belonged to a maid assigned to Eva Braun. These letters offered more than domestic reflections. They revealed a deeply personal account of the maid's fears as life at the Berghof grew increasingly oppressive. She wrote of long evenings spent preparing rooms for gatherings of Hitler's inner circle, of the rigid expectations placed upon the staff, and of the oppressive silence that followed any misstep. What struck Harland was the emotional weight in her words, an undercurrent of anxiety, as though she sensed unseen watchers analyzing every gesture. In one passage she confessed, "We live as though every whisper carries through the walls. The air is not free here. One must breathe carefully." To the soldiers who found them, these letters were more than relics. They were a rare human perspective from inside a world that had grown increasingly paranoid. Historian accounts would later confirm what the Maid hinted at. By late 1944, Hitler's entourage had become consumed by fear of betrayal. The failed July 20th assassination attempt had triggered purges that rippled through every level of German society. Even domestic staff were not immune from scrutiny. Many were interrogated by the Gestapo, and several disappeared without explanation. The reveal of these letters raised immediate questions. Why were they hidden in Munich rather than remaining at the Berghof? Why had the maid, whose identity remained uncertain, felt compelled to record her private fears at all, let alone conceal them within a household connected to the Nazi leadership? And perhaps most puzzlingly, why did the letters stop abruptly in early 1945, leaving no explanation of what became of her? The British soldiers, recognizing the potential intelligence value of documents tied to Eva Braun's household, secured the letters and forwarded them to their divisional headquarters. Intelligence officers were well aware that even minor details from personal writings could provide insight into the internal dynamics of Hitler's retreating government. As the Third Reich crumbled, thousands of officers fled, destroyed records, or attempted to blend into civilian life. Any surviving documents, no matter how small, could contribute to the reconstruction of events in those final months. Even today, the story of these letters serves as a reminder that major historical events are often illuminated by the experiences of individuals who were never meant to be remembered. The Maid's words capture a world defined by fear and control, a world where personal relationships were dangerous, and trust was a rare luxury. They also hint at a deeper mystery. Someone, whether she or another staff member, had gone to great lengths to hide the bundle rather than destroy it. As the reconnaissance team moved on to secure the next building, the echoes of her voice remained on those fragile pages, raising more questions than answers. Who was this maid? What exactly did she witness in the final days of the Nazi regime? And why did her letters end so suddenly, just as the Allied advance began tightening around Bavaria? Those questions would follow investigators long after the battle-scarred streets of Munich fell silent. By the winter of 1944, Germany was fighting a war it could no longer hope to win. But inside the walls of the Berghof, Hitler's mountain residence high above Berchtesgaden, the collapse was concealed behind forced smiles, rigid routines, and an atmosphere of tightening suspicion. It was here that the unnamed maid whose letters surfaced in Munich began to sense that something invisible and dangerous was closing in around the staff. Few understand how drastically life changed in the Berghof during those final months. Conversations became whispers, social gatherings dwindled, and the presence of the SS grew heavier with every passing week. The change would eventually uproot the maid from the mountain retreat and send her into Munich, setting in motion the chain of events preserved in her fragile writings. The struggle became clear when she described her abrupt transfer from the Berghof to a residence maintained by the Reich Chancellery in Munich. Transfers of domestic staff were not uncommon, but the timing was unusual. The SS, shaken by the July 20th plot and worried about potential infiltration among household workers, often reshuffled personnel under the pretext of operational security. For someone like this maid, young, quiet, and previously unnoticed, the move must have been terrifying. Munich, which had once been the cultural heart of the Nazi movement, was now a battered city besieged by Allied bombers. Air raid sirens cut through the night with increasing frequency, and entire blocks lay in ruins. The letters describe her surprise at seeing the devastation for the first time. The city feels hollowed out. We walk through smoke and stone as though passing through the bones of something great that has died. It was in this broken city that she met the young Bavarian railway worker, identified only as L, whose existence becomes the emotional anchor of her writings. Historically, railway workers were uniquely positioned in the clandestine networks that aided Allied POWs. They could pass information, hide escapees in cargo wagons, or smuggle food past checkpoints. Numerous reports from MI9 corroborate this. Bavarian rail lines, particularly those feeding into Munich's massive Ostbahnhof, were known points of resistance activity. The maid writes of meeting L by chance during an air raid, when both sought shelter in the same cellar. What began as whispered conversations in the dim glow of emergency lamps slowly evolved into a fragile exchange of coded notes. These coded messages, according to her letters, relied on references to train routes and timetables. Details she barely understood but which L evidently used to communicate with resistance contacts. She never explicitly states that she helped these operations, but her tone suggests she became a silent participant, carrying notes or watching for security patrols. Her descriptions match known Gestapo sweeps of that period. Random house searches, street interrogations, and frequent railway checks prompted by increased power escape attempts in late 1944. Intelligence records confirm that at least 3 Allied airmen successfully passed through Munich's outskirts that December, disappearing into the Alps with help from local sympathizers. The insight her letters provide comes into sharp focus when she describes a moment of dread. She believed one of the coded notes had been intercepted. She writes of returning to her assigned residence to find 2 SS officers speaking in low tones with her supervisor. Their conversation stopped abruptly when she entered. From that night forward, she says, someone seemed to be watching her. Footsteps in hallways would fade the moment she turned, and her room was searched more than once under the pretext of enforcing blackout regulations. Historical accounts show that by late 1944, the SS and Gestapo were conducting widespread internal investigations in Munich, detaining railway workers, civil servants, and even household staff on suspicion of disloyalty. Her letters grow more frantic after the new year. She describes L becoming increasingly cautious, urging her not to meet in the open anymore. In one of the final letters found by the British, she writes, "I fear I have endangered him. I fear I have endangered myself without ever understanding how." The tension is palpable, and the historical backdrop supports her fears. January 1945 saw dozens of arrests across Bavaria as the Gestapo attempted to dismantle the last remnants of local resistance. Many detainees vanished into temporary holding cells or were shipped to Dachau, which maintained several satellite camps in Munich. The reveal comes when her letters stop, without explanation, after mentioning that L had failed to appear at their usual meeting point near the Sendlinger Tor station. She writes only, "This is not like him. Something has happened." And then nothing. Not another date. Not another page. The British investigators who later examined the letters noted with particular interest that the handwriting becomes shaky in the final entries, as though she were writing in haste or fear of being discovered. The modern reflection here is inescapable. Her words echo countless untold stories of ordinary people pulled into extraordinary danger during the war's final months. She was not a spy, not a member of a resistance cell, simply a young woman who found herself entangled in a quiet struggle against oppression. But the closing note of Part 2 is one of deepening uncertainty. Both she and the railway worker disappear from the written record at the exact moment when Munich descends into its most chaotic phase. And the absence of official documentation raises a haunting question for investigators then and now. Did the SS catch them, or did they slip away into the labyrinth of a crumbling city, leaving only these letters behind? When the British reconnaissance team delivered the mysterious letters to a field interrogation center outside Augsburg in early May 1945, they had little idea how significant the documents might be. The war in Europe was entering its final days, yet intelligence units were still scrambling to piece together the movements, motives, and internal fractures within the collapsing Nazi regime. A surprising amount of critical information in those final hours came not from captured officers but from scraps of paper, diaries, notes, abandoned plans, left behind in empty houses and shattered offices. The Maid's letters, written in a careful, hesitant hand, soon drew the attention of analysts who sensed they might contain details that aligned with known but incomplete intelligence on German resistance networks and POW escape routes. The struggle facing these analysts was immense. By spring 1945, the British Army's Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Center, CSDIC, near Augsburg was overwhelmed with documents and detainees. Their task was to screen thousands of captured officers, couriers, clerks, and civilian workers, some of whom still attempted to conceal their roles in the Nazi hierarchy. At the same time, teams were reviewing mountains of paperwork retrieved from abandoned government facilities across Bavaria. The Maid's letters, personal, emotional, and without any overt military information, might easily have been dismissed. But several passages caught the attention of Lieutenant Arthur Keller, a German-speaking intelligence officer with experience tracing underground communication lines. What intrigued Keller most were her references to train routes and timetables, especially headings like "Line 4 passes safely tonight," or "The morning run toward Garmisch remains watched." To a casual reader, these sounded like simple observations of life in a railway city. But to Keller, they echoed the coded phrasing used by local helpers who had facilitated prisoner escapes since 1943. MI9 reports had long noted that resistance networks in southern Germany relied on railway workers to pass messages, hide fugitives in freight compartments, or coordinate safe movement during blackouts. The Maid's railway companion, L, seemed to be connected to such a group, though his exact role remained unclear. At the interrogation center, analysts cross-referenced her descriptions with confirmed Allied escape lines. The best-known network in the region was the Kurierlinie Alpen, a loosely organized chain of sympathizers who risked their lives guiding Allied POWs from camps around Moosburg and Landsberg through the Bavarian Alps into Austria or Italy. British officers found several correlations between the Maid's account and known incidents, including a documented Allied airman who escaped near Munich in December 1944 and vanished along a route toward Bad Tolls. Though the Maid never mentioned nationalities or names, her dates and locations aligned uncannily with the timeline of these escapes. The insight gained from these letters went beyond logistics. They provided a rare emotional perspective, a window into how an ordinary civilian, living under SS scrutiny, could become entangled in dangerous networks without fully understanding them. One letter quoted by analysts left a strong impression. He says the lines are breaking, that they may not hold much longer. If they fall, many will die. He tells me not to fear, but I do. Her words captured the disintegrating morale among internal resistance circles as the Gestapo tightened surveillance on Munich's railway yards. But the reveal emerged in a chilling detail. When Keller compared her descriptions of missing railway workers with Gestapo arrest logs captured from a Munich command post, a pattern began to surface. Several civilian railway employees arrested in January 1945 were listed only by initials H, R, L. The dates of their disappearance matched nearly exactly the timeline in the Maid's letters. Yet one discrepancy stood out. The record showed no mention of a maid captured in the same period. There was no entry corresponding to her initials, no notation of a household worker detained for aiding resistance activity. Analysts began to question whether she had been arrested at all, or whether she had simply vanished amid the chaos as Munich's command structure collapsed. This discovery prompted a deeper review of personnel rosters from the Berghof. Investigators spoke with former staffers held at the interrogation center. Many denied that any maid had been transferred abruptly in late 1944, though several hesitated when questioned about staff changes following the July plot. A few admitted quietly that people had been removed for questioning and never returned. But none could, or would, confirm her identity. This silence cast suspicion on the Berghof administration, notorious for destroying records during the final weeks of April 1945. Several rooms in the mountain residence were burned by SS guards before surrender. It was entirely possible that her personnel file had been intentionally eradicated. The modern lesson from this phase of the investigation is clear. Wartime bureaucracy, especially within a collapsing dictatorship, often preserves its secrets by accident rather than intention. Countless minor figures, swept into the turmoil of the era, disappeared without documentation. The maid's voice, surviving only through her letters, proved more valuable than any official record ever could. Part 3 closes with a deepening sense of uncertainty. The analysts at Augsburg now understood that the letters were more than emotional reflections. They were potential evidence of an unrecorded resistance link inside one of the most guarded places in Nazi Germany. Yet the absence of concrete files, the disappearance of her companion, and the silence of surviving staff left a haunting gap. And so investigators were forced to confront a troubling possibility. The maid's fate might never have been written down at all, lost somewhere between the collapsing rail lines of Munich and the burning archives of the Berghof. In the next phase of the investigation, they would try to uncover where that trail ended. In the weeks following Germany's surrender, Allied investigators pored over the remnants of a shattered bureaucracy. Offices once buzzing with clerks and officers now lay littered with burned files, overturned typewriters, and soot-stained walls where shelves of documents had been deliberately set aflame. Yet among the ruins, scattered fragments still told stories. Stories of disappearances, interrogations, and hidden operations that had unfolded during the last desperate months of the war. It was within this landscape of half-erased evidence that the trail of Eva Braun's missing maid briefly resurfaced, only to vanish once again into the fog of a dying regime. The hook for this phase of the investigation came from a set of captured German logistics reports retrieved from a damaged SS administrative office near Bad Tolls. These documents, charred along the edges but still legible, listed routine personnel movements, guards transferred between stations, railway workers reassigned or suspended, civilians detained for questioning. To most Allied analysts, the names were merely part of a vast administrative collapse. But to Lieutenant Arthur Keller, the same officer studying the maid's letters at the interrogation center in Augsburg, one line stood out. A notation referring to civilian laborers removed from duty pending further inquiry in early January 1945. The initials provided, L, H, and R, matched the group of railway workers believed to have assisted Allied POWs. This immediately raised the struggle central to Part 4. Bridging the gap between fragmentary documents and the emotional, subjective accounts written by the maid. Her letters mentioned railway workers disappearing without warning. And here was the first formal record that corroborated her fears. Yet there was still no mention of her own detainment. Her name, or even her initials, were nowhere to be found. Not in logistical notes, not in personnel transfers, not in the Gestapo's regional records seized from Munich. This absence troubled investigators. When people vanished under the SS, they often left behind at least a trace. A confiscation form, a transport order, a cell assignment. But for her, there was silence. The insight deepened when analysts cross-referenced these SS reports with captured Allied POW debriefings. Several escaped airmen recalled hearing rumors about a local network of helpers in Munich, some railway men, a few factory workers, and a woman connected to a household of the Nazi elite. The phrase was vague and impossible to verify, but the implication was notable. The Maid, or someone like her, had been known to the escape network, even if only through whispers. MI9 archives later confirmed that scattered references to a woman in Munich who carries messages appeared in multiple debriefings from winter 1944 to 45. None gave a name. None could confirm her fate. The reveal came when investigators visited former SS compounds outside Bad Tolls, including a training school for officer cadets. The site, once bustling with recruits, now stood eerily quiet. Barracks stripped bare, training fields abandoned, and paper debris blowing across the gravel yard. In an administrative building, Allied teams uncovered personnel logs dating from late 1944 to early 1945. But the most critical pages, those covering the precise period when the Maid's final letters were written, were missing. Torn cleanly from the binding, they left only stubs where names and assignments should have been. The absence felt intentional. When questioned, former SS staff dismissed the idea that anyone from Eva Braun's domestic circle would have been processed through Bad Tolls. Yet their testimonies were riddled with contradictions. One officer claimed no household workers had ever been detained for treasonous activity. Another insisted that anyone associated with the Berghof would have been transferred to Munich or Berchtesgaden for investigation. A third stated bluntly that, in January, no one knew where anyone was going anymore. The lack of consistency suggested either genuine confusion or deliberate evasion. Looking deeper, investigators realized that January 1945 represented one of the darkest periods in the internal meltdown of the Nazi state. SS units evacuated entire offices, relocated prisoners, destroyed evidence, and carried out rapid-fire interrogations as Allied forces drew closer. Many detainees from this period simply disappeared, unrecorded deaths, unmarked transfers, or hurried executions carried out before retreating into the Alps. It was entirely plausible that the Maid, if arrested, had been lost in this bureaucratic chaos. But it was equally possible that she had managed to flee, blending into the civilian exodus, escaping the bombing of Munich. The modern reflection on this phase of the inquiry underscores a sobering truth. History often preserves the powerful while erasing the vulnerable. The Maid was neither a political figure nor a documented resistance operative. She was a civilian whose life intersected with the machinery of war at precisely the wrong moment. Her fate, unrecorded and unacknowledged, mirrors the experiences of thousands who vanished in the winter of 1945, consumed by the disintegration of the Nazi state. As Part 4 draws to a close, investigators were left with more uncertainty than clarity. The torn personnel records, the contradictory testimonies, and the silence surrounding her disappearance all pointed to a deliberate erasure, or simply to the destructive collapse of a regime that no longer had the means to track its own actions. Either way, the trail remained obscured. And so the case pivoted toward a more troubling question. If the SS kept no record of her, perhaps someone else did, someone with reason to hide the truth. Part 5 would delve into the surviving voices of Berghof staff, and the uncomfortable secrets they carried with them into captivity. In the months following Germany's surrender, Allied interrogators shifted their focus toward those who had lived and worked closest to the centers of Nazi power. The Berghof, Hitler's mountain residence perched above Berchtesgaden, became a primary source of both information and unanswered questions. Dozens of staff members, from valets to drivers to kitchen workers, were taken into custody and brought to makeshift interrogation sites across Bavaria. Their testimonies offered rare glimpses into the final days within Hitler's inner circle. Yet when investigators asked about one particular figure, a maid who had served in Eva Braun's household and whose letters hinted at dangerous involvement with local resistance, responses became strangely cautious. It was here, in the voices of those who had survived the regime's collapse, that the next layer of mystery emerged. The hook came as members of the British Field Security Section began conducting structured interviews with Berghof personnel at a temporary holding facility near Berchtesgaden. Some former staff appeared eager to distance themselves from the regime, claiming ignorance of political affairs. Others remained guarded, answering only in clipped sentences. But a pattern soon surfaced. Whenever the interrogators mentioned a maid transferred to Munich in late 1944, attention shifted, voices faltered, and memories became suspiciously vague. A former housekeeper insisted there was no such transfer. Staff remained stable until the evacuation. A kitchen worker contradicted her minutes later, stating that several girls were moved around after Christmas, though he could not recall names. The inconsistencies suggested more than simple forgetfulness. They hinted at a deliberate effort to obscure the truth. This set the struggle of Part 5, separating genuine memory from deliberate concealment. Many of the individuals questioned had lived in fear of the SS throughout the war. Even in Allied custody, the habit of silence was deeply ingrained. Some still believed that speaking too openly about disappearances could endanger them or their families. One former valet quietly admitted off-record that staff transfers had increased significantly after the July 20th plot. "Everyone knew the Gestapo was watching the house," he said. "Anyone who seemed troubled or too curious, they could be gone by morning." His tone suggested that he had witnessed such removals firsthand. The insight deepened when investigators compared these testimonies with documentation found at various SS compounds. Among the records recovered from a damaged administrative office near Bad Tolls were handwritten notes referencing internal security reviews of household personnel connected to Obersalzberg. The dates corresponded precisely to the period when the maid had last written. Yet, once again, her name did not appear. Instead, the notes listed several non-essential domestic workers, who had been reassigned for operational concerns. The vagueness of the phrasing made the investigators uneasy. Historically, such euphemisms often concealed arrests, interrogations, or worse. The breakthrough came during a search of a former SS training facility near Bad Tolls. Investigators discovered a stack of personnel logs concealed beneath a collapsed shelf. They contained rosters of guards, clerks, and support staff moving through the region in early 1945. But the most critical period, mid-January to early February, was missing several pages. The tier marks were clean, deliberate. It was as if someone had removed specific names shortly before fleeing the compound. And these dates aligned exactly with the disappearance of the railway worker L. and the abrupt halt in the maid's letters. The reveal intensified when one former SS adjutant, perhaps feeling the pressure of interrogation, admitted that a small number of civilian detainees had been held at a temporary holding site south of Bad Tolls during January 1945. Workers suspected of aiding escapes, he said reluctantly. When pressed, he added, some were released. Some were moved. Some we never saw again. His statement fell short of confirming the maid's fate, but it introduced a possibility that investigators could not ignore. She may have been detained outside formal channels, processed briefly, and then lost in the chaos of Nazi retreat. As investigators dug deeper, one troubling detail emerged. Several staff members reported that pages from personnel files at the Berghof had been burned in the final days before the Americans arrived. According to multiple testimonies, SS men arrived on April 25, 1945, demanding access to storage rooms containing staff records. Hours later, smoke rose from behind the main residence. One witness recalled seeing lists of names and papers with photographs tossed into the flames. If the maid's file had been among them, her existence within the administrative record might have been effectively erased. The modern reflection here is stark. Dictatorships rarely preserve evidence of their crimes. More often, they leave only fragments, half-truths, burned pages, and the memories of frightened witnesses. The maid's story, preserved only through her own letters, survived despite attempts, whether intentional or circumstantial, to remove every other trace of her presence. As Part 5 ends, the atmosphere is one of tightening uncertainty. The inconsistent testimonies, the missing personnel logs, and the deliberate destruction of staff files all point to a chilling conclusion. Someone within the Berghof hierarchy had reason to hide what happened to her. Whether she was detained, quietly executed, or lost during a chaotic transfer remains unknown. But her disappearance clearly left a shadow that those who survived the Berghof were unwilling, or afraid, to illuminate. This leads investigators toward one final avenue of inquiry: the post-war archives assembled for the Nuremberg trials, where scattered documents from across the collapsing Reich were brought together. Part 6 would follow the letters' path into those vast archives, and the silence that surrounds them to this day. When the war ended and the guns fell silent across Europe, the vast machinery of investigation began to turn. Allied forces, now transitioning from combat operations to reconstruction and accountability, faced the monumental task of cataloging the wreckage of a fallen regime. Evidence poured into central collection points from all corners of occupied Germany. Files rescued from fires, correspondence seized from bunkers, ledgers pried from abandoned offices. Among these countless fragments traveled the Maid's letters, preserved carefully by British investigators who sensed, even then, that they held a human story woven into the larger tapestry of Nazi collapse. Their final known destination was a document reception center that would feed directly into the archives being assembled for the Nuremberg trials. The hook of this chapter emerges from a little-known aspect of those early post-war months. The Allies collected not only orders, memos, and military directives, but thousands of personal writings in an attempt to map the psychological and administrative landscape of the Third Reich. The Maid's letters arrived at the Nuremberg Document Center in mid-1945, sealed in a thin folder marked simply, Domestic Personnel, Munich. They were considered minor evidence, unlikely to appear in any courtroom, but valuable as contextual material. Yet even here, surrounded by the most notorious documents of the war, the letters maintained their quiet, haunting power. The struggle in this phase of the investigation was sifting through the enormity of the archival haul. Historians estimate that more than 300,000 individual documents were reviewed before and during the Nuremberg trials. Much of the material came in damaged or partial form, requiring painstaking reconstruction. Against this backdrop, the Maid's letters risked being overwhelmed, absorbed into the administrative ocean of a regime collapsing under its own weight. Investigators assigned to civilian accounts tried to trace her identity through what remained of the surviving personnel lists from the Berghof and Munich. But every search returned the same result: no matching name, no matching initials, no reference to a transfer order. She was invisible to the bureaucracy that had recorded nearly everything else. The insight into her story comes from a brief report written in late 1945 by a British analyst assigned to the Nuremberg archive. In his summary, he noted that the letters may pertain to a civilian associate of a domestic worker network previously under SS scrutiny, but added, almost reluctantly, that further identification of the writer is not presently possible due to insufficient personnel files. This line, only a sentence long, became the last official reference to her in the archival record. The investigative trail simply stopped. No follow-up note. No renewed inquiry. No cross-indexing with additional detainee lists that surfaced later. By then, Allied priorities had shifted toward prosecuting major war criminals, rebuilding destroyed regions, and stabilizing post-war governments. The reveal in this final chapter lies not in a dramatic discovery, but in the heavy silence that followed. The Maid's letters, once the focus of field investigators in Munich and Augsburg, faded into the background of a massive archival effort. They were filed, boxed, and eventually transferred to long-term storage. In later decades, as historians requested access to documents related to Eva Braun and the Berghof, references to domestic staff were minimal. Many folders held only a few surviving scraps. Entire personnel rosters were missing, destroyed in the final days of April 1945 or lost in the chaotic relocations that followed. Yet the letters remained, an intact testimony when so much else had vanished. The modern reflection on her story resonates beyond her individual fate. Her life represents the thousands of unnamed civilians who navigated the dangerous intersections between obedience, fear, and quiet defiance during the Third Reich's final year. Many lived close enough to power to hear its cracking foundations, yet remained vulnerable enough to be erased without a trace. Her relationship with the railway worker L., her coded notes, her growing fear, these were the private struggles of ordinary people caught in extraordinary danger. It is a reminder that history is not only shaped by leaders and armies, but by the individuals whose voices survive only by chance. The closing moments of Part 6 bring the narrative full circle. Decades after the end of the war, researchers reviewing Nuremberg's secondary files rediscovered the Maid's letters, still tied with the original strip of cloth, still carrying the faint scent of the paper on which she wrote hurriedly by lamplight. Their content offers no certainty, no explanation, no documented ending. The final page remains forever poised on the precipice of calamity, stopping abruptly with her fear for Elle, and the sound of footsteps she believed were following her. There is no definitive record of her execution, no proof of her escape, no confirmation of her survival among the millions of displaced people wandering Europe in 1945. What remains is the fragile voice of a young woman whose world was collapsing, and the document she left behind, found by chance in an abandoned Munich residence by soldiers who could not have imagined the mystery they were uncovering. And so the documentary ends where the historical record does, with unanswered questions, a vanishing trail, and a story preserved only because her letters happened to survive when everything else around her was lost. Her words endure, not as evidence of her fate, but as a reminder of the countless lives swallowed by the final darkness of the war.